Storms seize the earth. Earthquakes cause her to tremble. Mudslides decimate everything in its path. Wars and rumors of wars announce the nations. Watch out. Hunker down. Don't get noticed. Slip to safety. Quiet office conversations consume our thoughts. Deafening anger, glimpses of violence, we hide. All creation cries out. In this life, you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. You, my child, have overcome the world. My name is Barbara Bagley, and this is my presentation on trauma. How is it that two people from totally different homes go through a similar experience, such as there could be alcoholism or drug addiction in the home, or a parent could leave and leave a single mom to care for the children, and yet in one home that child grows up, makes it through school, does fairly decent on their grades in spite of all the struggles, even seeing domestic violence and living in poverty, and yet be able to finish high school and graduate, go on to college, get a decent job and meet somebody, get married, and seem to be showing no ill effects from their growth as a child. And then yet another child can experience similar situations and yet struggle so much with self-harm. Academically, they do very poorly. They get into fights in school. They wind up being in jail later in life. They develop diseases and drug addiction and mental health problems. Why is it that one can do well and the other will struggle so badly? So what is trauma? According to the American Psychological Association, trauma is an emotional response to a harmful or threatening event. We'll learn more about those threatening events in the next slide. So on this slide, we see a list of different types of traumatic events. Natural disasters. We've experienced many of those recently, like in North Carolina, where they have experienced mudslides and flooding. People have lost their lives. Their homes have been destroyed. The infrastructure there is completely destroyed. Out in California, there's been wildfires. People are suffering from loss of home and in their lives. We also see criminal events like carjackings and theft or rape. Other types of trauma are accidents, like car accidents or a slip and a fall. Sometimes children experience traumatic events, or older people or people who are handicapped may experience physical or emotional or sexual abuse at the hands of their caregivers or neglect. Sometimes people witness domestic violence or community violence on a regular basis. Some countries struggle with war day after day, just living in that turmoil, in that fear. Death of a loved one. Sometimes people are sitting there for a very long time, sitting by the bedside of a loved one as they watch them suffer and die. All of these events can affect us. The scripture tells us that the earth is crying out, writhing in pain. All creation cries out because sin has entered the world and has affected both the world and all of creation, the animals and us as humans. How we perceive these events has that emotional response that can affect our mental health in the future. In the next slide, we're going to talk about the different types of trauma. On this slide, we can see the different types of trauma. The first one is called acute trauma. Acute trauma is a single incident, such as a house fire. The next one is called chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is repeated and prolonged, such as abuse or domestic violence. The last one is called complex trauma, which is exposure to multiple or varied traumatic events, often interpersonal in nature. This one is often associated with childhood abuse, neglect, or abandonment. This one makes the child feel persistent terror, fear, or hopelessness, with no chance of escape. Now we're going to move on to the cost to society. Okay, on this next slide, we see the cost to society. The first one there is foster care. So according to the United States Department of Health and Human Services, from the years of 2013 to 2017, there has been a 6% increase of children coming into care annually. And out of that, 36% of those children are under the age of 4. Children who experience maltreatment at an earlier age are at a much higher risk of later behavioral disorders and impairments across multiple domains. We also find illnesses are on an increase from trauma. According to the ACEs study, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences, illnesses such as cancer, diabetes, heart disease, suicide, substance abuse are all increased. Also, the ACE study also tells us about incarceration, which increases when somebody has multiple trauma occurrences. The next one is services in schools. In most public schools, there are multiple faculty that are there just because of behaviors with children to help them to be able to do the best they can in school, but this costs our school systems a lot of money to hire these people and to take those positions to work with the children that have had traumatic effects in their lives. And the last one, of course, is mental illness, which we know that from the trauma response sometimes can cause multiple mental illness disorders. Multiple population levels studies report that childhood adversity, particularly child physical and sexual abuse, neglect, and family violence, are associated with the onset and persistence of psychological disorders in adulthood and with higher levels of disorder-related functional impairment across the lifespan. The next slide we're going to talk about is the different symptoms that we may experience when we have a traumatic event. On this slide, we'll talk about the symptoms that are associated with trauma. Some of the symptoms that are pretty common are trouble sleeping, nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks. Also, some people feel anxious or depressed for unknown reasons, for deep sadness, zoning out, feeling numb, easily agitated, easily startled. Some people have behaviors and acting out in school or self-destructive. Some people avoid certain places or people that remind them of the event. Sometimes people have problems with self-blame or trouble remembering parts of the event, shame, poor academic performance. Some people experience symptoms of nausea or headaches and an increased heart rate, sweating and dizziness, and fatigue. These are only a small list of the symptoms. There's many others that are associated with trauma. On the next slide, we are going to talk about the treatments that we can do for trauma. On this slide, we see a few of the common treatments that they're using today. The first one is trauma-focused CBT, which involves gradual exposure to trauma reminders. It is done in 3 different stages. The first stage is stabilization and skills building. This one often involves the parents to help them learn some skills that they can use to help with the behavioral issues that they may have at home. It also teaches them about supporting their children while they go through this. This is normally done with the non-offending parent. The second stage is trauma narration and processing. In this stage, they gradually talk about the trauma and process it as they work through it, and the clinician will work carefully with the client as they build on that narration story. The last stage is called integration and consolidation. In that stage, the caregiver will focus on solidifying the skills that were learned in the earlier phases, including enhancing safety and developing coping mechanisms and openly communicating about the traumatic event to promote long-term recovery and resilience. Another treatment is EMDR, that is eye movement desensitization, and also dialectical behavior therapy, which teaches people to identify and replace certain behaviors that are not working well for them with ones that will work better for them. And the last one is trauma-informed parenting intervention. In this next slide that is coming up, we're going to talk about different types of support. This slide talks about caregiver support and also caregiver discouragement. Parents can be effective in helping their child after a traumatic event by supporting them and helping them to regulate traumatic behavior, and also helping them to talk about and process the difficult experience. Some of the ways that parents sometimes will discourage any growth in healing for the child is when the parent is avoiding the issue of the traumatic event. They don't wish to talk about it and pretend almost as if it didn't happen. This can be very confusing to the child. Another thing that can happen is during the time when they're learning the skills and being trained, some parents may avoid participating in the skill training. Because of this, they will not have what they need, the skills they need to deal with the child's behaviors that come out because of trauma, and this also will hinder the healing process for the child. And other things that parents may do that will hinder the child is to blame the child for the traumatic event, which can create anxiety in the child and cause the child to overgeneralize the event. Sometimes some children may say things such as, "It's my fault that I was raped," or "No one will ever understand what I went through, so I should just keep my mouth shut." In this way, the children are not able to process the event and to heal from it. In the next slide, we're going to talk about the clinician's support. Beyond the usual theoretical approach and treatment planning, the clinician can be supportive to the client in their treatment process by being aware of any key parent factors that may hinder the treatment process. Also, the clinician can be aware and supportive of the caregivers by helping them to become engaged in the process. Also, according to the ACA and the AACC, we cannot force our Christian views upon anyone. But if the client is interested in having a spiritual integrative approach, there are numerous things that we can use. We could use prayer in our sessions and support our clients in that way. We could also use scripture. The other ways that we could, and of course all of this is according to whether or not the client is open and willing for it, but if they're open to it, we could also bring their pastor or other religious leader in on sessions, or also refer to him for help in their particular belief system. The integrative approach can also be done privately with the counselor themselves, where we could be praying quietly to ourselves before meeting with our client so that we can be better prepared to help our client and to help their healing process. In this last slide, I've provided resources to better understand trauma. The first one is a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. It is an easy-read book to understand how trauma affects the body. The next one is a podcast called Encountering You with Laura Williams. Laura Williams is a developmental and relational trauma therapist who uses spiritual integration in her teachings. The next one is a website called Adverse Childhood Experiences. On this website, you can find a lot of information with articles and research. The next resource is Tim Fletcher's YouTube videos on trauma. The particular one I showed you here is just one of many of Tim Fletcher's YouTube videos. He does an excellent job explaining trauma and its effects on the body, and also understanding particular treatments. He has numerous videos to watch. The last one is a video on YouTube called Removed. I use this one here because it is a video that explains the effects of a child going into foster care and the trauma that they have experienced. It's a very moving video. I hope you enjoyed my presentation on trauma, and I thank you for watching. This is my final slide that just includes the references that I had used in my presentation.